Now that you understand the point, it's time to look at the second part of the PEE, which is evidence. By the end of the video, you should be able to answer the following questions. What is the evidence used to do? What should be in your evidence? And what is context? Go back to the section in your notes where you wrote about the point and start a new heading titled Evidence. This is the note that you should have in evidence. Your evidence should be a quote, and you must provide context for it. You should also include this in your notes. Context is the information needed for your reader to understand how your quote fits into the story. Remember that example paragraph that we looked at in both the overview video and in the point video? We're going to continue to use that paragraph here as we look at what evidence is. Now we've already identified the point, that very first sentence in the paragraph where it says, in the novel, The Breadwinner, the main character, Parvana, is made out to be a very brave person. That's our point. Now it's time to look at the evidence. This is the evidence part of this paragraph. It's easy to spot the evidence because it should be a quote. There can be some times when the evidence isn't a quote, but if you see a quote, it's most likely evidence. You should almost always use a quote whenever you're writing your PEE paragraphs. The only time you shouldn't use a quote in your PEE paragraphs is when you're analyzing something like a photograph or a painting. In that case, you can just say things that you see in the photograph or on the painting. But if you're analyzing a book, you should be using a quote. Let's take a look at this quote by itself and see what goes inside of it. You can see the evidence reads, when Parvana goes to find father in the prison, she gets very scared, but she says to herself, Malali wouldn't be afraid, Parvana knew. Malali would form an army and lead it in a storming of the prison. In this piece of evidence, we can see that there is a context. In other words, the person writing this PEE provided us enough information to understand when this quote happens in the book. This quote happens when Parvana goes to find father in prison. They then included the quote itself, making sure to use correct punctuation and capitalization. Notice the way that they use the comma just before the quotation mark. And notice at the end of the quotation how the full stop is on the inside of the quotation marks. That's correct punctuation around a quotation. Let's look at another example. In Harry Potter, who is the main bad guy or antagonist? And we have this as the point that we already wrote. In the book Harry Potter by J.K. Rowling, the main bad guy or antagonist is Voldemort. And here would be a good piece of evidence that we could use in order to support this point. The evidence reads, in the book there is a prophecy by a character named Sybil Trelawney that says, the one with the power to vanquish the Dark Lord approaches. In this piece of evidence, you can see that the writer has provided enough context for us to be able to understand the quote, and they provided the quote itself. That makes for good evidence. Let's look at one more example. This question reads, what is the source of Luke Skywalker's ability in Star Wars? And we came up with a point that said, in the movie Star Wars by George Lucas, the source of Luke Skywalker's special abilities is called the Force. This is the evidence that we're going to use to support that point. The evidence reads, when Luke first joins the mission to rescue Princess Leia, he is trained by Obi-Wan Kenobi, who tells him over and over to use the Force. From this, we can see the context of the story in which the quote is used, and we can see the quote. Now that we see how to use the evidence, let's take a look at some examples. Once again, these examples come from the book Wonder. Take a look at A, B, and C. Only one of them is written correctly. Which one of these is a good example of correctly written evidence? Hopefully you identified that C is the best example of correctly written evidence. Now that we've studied what evidence is, go ahead and answer these 3 questions in your notebook before moving on to the next exercise. Pause the video if you need to. Go back to your notebook where you've started your 4 PEEs on Dr. Seuss, Wonder, Percy Jackson, and the famous painting Café Terrace at Night. You're going to write some evidence to support each of the points that you already wrote here, but I'm going to give you some clues to the evidence. You don't have to come up with your own evidence. I'm going to give you some pieces that will help you write your evidence. In this grid are all the pieces you need in order to write the evidence for each one of your 4 PEE paragraphs. Make sure you read all of the blocks before you begin. All of these blocks will be used, and every block will be used once and only once. Once you've finished writing all of your evidence for each one of your 4 paragraphs, you're ready to move to the explanation.